Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our next session in the Elire Strategy Summit, Data Analytics and Visualization for Your Organization. Again, my name is Jordan Fuger-Burmeister. I'm our Marketing Manager at Elire, and I'll be moderating this session. A couple of quick reminders before we get going. Just a reminder that all sessions do have individual links. So in case you haven't pre-registered for your next session, that will be sent towards the end of the presentation. All attendees have been placed on mute, but we are going to have that live Q&A at the end of the presentation. So as we're going throughout, if you have questions for our presenter, Dayton Paul, go ahead and submit those either to the chat or to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. With that, I'll hand it over to Dayton.
Thanks, Jordan, and welcome everybody to our session today, Data Analytics and Visualization of Your Organization. During today's session, we're going to talk about a few various aspects to data analytics itself, as well as some other topics around the cutting-edge analytical platforms that we're utilizing today. And off of that, we'll also talk through some of the material that is emerging within the data analytics world, as well as just management of all your various needs around analytics. Throughout the presentation, we'll see some various platforms that Elire utilizes to help visualize data from all different sorts of sources. So we'll see quite a few of the cutting edge platforms that are newer to the marketplace and some of the ones that we think are really at the cutting edge of integration in the world of analytics itself. To kick things off, we'll talk a little bit about Elire, and I'll introduce myself as well as someone who will be helping me on the call this morning. So Elire has been around for over 15 years, and we attribute a lot of that success to really partnering with all of our clients and really going with them on a journey to help strategically guide and help them get the best return on investment for any software, any optimization, or any real improvements around business processes as a whole. We offer quite a few services beyond some of those implementation aspects. Those include things like application roadmaps, business process improvements, really centering around a lot of end-user adoption and change management as well. And today we'll cover and highlight some of the real key products and road mapping initiatives under data analytics and visualization. And then obviously one of the other services noted there, as well as project management. My name is Dayton Paul, senior consultant here at Elire, practicing on various initiatives and implementations within data analytics, as well as some of the ERP and HCM spaces. So we'll see a lot of crossover today in terms of analytics in the ERP and HCM world, as well as analytics as a whole. To really kick things off, we'll talk about analytics in an ever-changing landscape. So this is really going to help paint the picture of where data started as a whole. So how companies really started consuming data early on and how that's really morphed into some of the analytics platforms that we've seen pop up within the last 10, 15, 20 years. And then we'll talk about the places where within the last decade, the analytics space is really going. And that's really the cutting edge piece where we'll see a lot of the buzzwords that are really important to analytics as a whole start to creep in. Things like machine learning, artificial intelligent and ledger database systems. So one of the key things that really started the evolution of analytics as a whole is the manufacturing resource planning implementations that started in the 1950s. So really around that period of time, that's where you see a lot of those legacy pictures of IBM delivering large-scale computers to businesses across the world, things that had 1-2 megabytes and took up a whole office space. That's really where we start to see computer software in general being pushed to businesses to be able to really enhance some of their business processes. That was really where a lot of data itself started to be generated and consumed within the analytics space as a whole before analytics was even really a thing. So this was just almost creating a ledger, which led to some of the further developments within the evolution of analytics, where we start to see some of the bolt-on platforms being developed and some of the need for additional analyzing outside of some of just data retention itself. Really started in the 1970s with the introduction of what's called MRP2, or that Manufacturing Resource Planning Part 2. That's really where things outside of manufacturing and supply chain really started to come into play as well. So things around just financial data, accounting, and some of the more esoteric spaces that are really outside of just that core manufacturing processing. In that period of time, it really started to incorporate some of the things that would eventually lead to the explosion of those really tailored ERP systems, which started really in the 1990s. That's where we begin to see a lot of really ERP implementations taking hold across the US and across the world. And with that, that's really where we see a pretty big explosion in the amount of bolt-on analytics platforms and services that are available to really help clients analyze and individuals analyze data in a more in-depth and more pervasive sort of nature. So within the last 30 years, that's where we really see some of the things that we think of as like traditional transactional database analytics. And really, it's only been within the past 10 to 15 years that we've seen some of the bigger initiatives, things like big data, AI, and predictive analytics really take hold. And that's really where the space is now. A lot of sort of the things that went on in the 90s and early 2000s allowed us to push into this newer, broader space for analytics as a whole, and particularly with big data. You see a lot of these points on here. And of course, you know, there's always the thought process that these revolutionary changes are spurred on by something. I think that's truly the case. So we'll talk about some of the real shocks that push the analytics space to sort of develop further initiatives and look at a broader horizon as a whole. So within those particular analytical shocks, we've seen a couple really once in a lifetime events pop up recently that are really pushing businesses in all sorts of new directions. But really, it coincided first beginning in the 1980s. We saw some of the MRP2 spurring into what ultimately became ERP systems, and a lot of that additional analysis for financials, the incorporation of business side data on top of manufacturing data and supply chain data was really spurred on by a lot of those financial crises that really popped up in the 1980s with the Latin American debt crisis, some of the inflation concerns in the US and the UK, as well as Central Europe, and really coinciding with the first stage of Chinese economic reform. So market opening, new supply sources. It really was the first period of time where globalization was really taking hold in not only manufacturing markets, but financial and technological markets as well. So that really pushed the boom in the ERP adoption as a whole. In terms of some of the newer things that are really pushing more of the behavioral bounds and the need for analytics that go beyond that transactional data. So insight that's driven from machine learning and artificial intelligence and new theories really started with the dot-com bubble and went all the way through to the housing crisis up until the Great Recession. But that really was kind of the birth period of what's called behavioral economics. So of course, there's the classical and neoclassical thought of rational hypotheses, but I think we all know that humans aren't always rational. So this helped kind of spur some new thought into individual decision making. One decision obviously doesn't fit all. I think we all know that that now. that was a little bit more of an aberrant thought back then. And then, of course, some of the pricing models are newer. We don't rely as much on some of the efficient market hypotheses points. We rely more on what we'll see later in the presentation, which is a focus on sort of statistical analysis to help aid decision making, which really is aided by a lot of the just decision making material in general. And some of the things that are really pushing big data and the incorporation of a lot of external data sources is really centered around some of the things that we've seen recently. The Great Recession pushed us in a lot of new financial directions, market analysis directions, and making sure that we're placing businesses within a strong foothold and preparing for different financial outcomes. And COVID-19, again, lended a new shock that we hadn't seen, at least within the last 100 years, which is a total disruption of business operations that's really outside of the conventional cyclical market cycle. And that really is the kind of pinnacle of what's called a black swan event. So something that's really unseen, almost unpredictable, but you have to react to it when it ultimately does come up. And we'll see some of the ways that data analytics can assist in the future with a lot of the monitoring and maintenance of really essential data in real time, especially when we encounter things like COVID-19. In general, this is all centered around data. So we've talked about sort of the history of data, the shocks that kind of pushed it in the direction that we're seeing now. It's also important to notice and note that data is a really big asset, not only at the company level, but at the individual level as well. A lot of times it's been pretty hot within the last 10, 15 years to call data the next oil or the digital oil. And in terms of the value that we're seeing and the steep increase in adoption and usage across the world, for those perspectives, it's a fair assessment. The pervasiveness of use for all businesses is continuing to grow, and we see the value of individual assets of data continue to increase. The overall market is not looking at slowing down. We can see that we're almost at a speed up point here in terms of the annual valuation growth. So exponential growth is continue to be expected. This year alone, the average person's data, so just what you generate walking around using a smartphone, doing searches within Google, adding friends on Facebook, that data is worth $2,000 to $3,000 just in a year alone to gain commercial insight. And that continues to grow with the thought of, well, what's my business data worth? Well, it's worth a whole heck of a lot more than that. And really the profit margin that is available for the difference between the cost of acquisition for all that data and then what it's actually worth is massive. You can see that the average cost of acquiring that data is as little as 26 cents. So it really is, if you can glean those insights from the data that you're really accessing and acquiring and utilizing in your business operations, you can see that the margin there is absolutely massive. In terms of really the how you value that data as an enterprise and not as an individual as a whole is really based on sort of the ideas of a economic market. So what's the external market? Basically, how much can you sell it for? Which is really used a lot with consumer data. The one that I think is more beneficial and is a lot less glamorous and seldom less talked about is internal uses for your business, helping assist in sort of consumer direction, insider sentiment. So how just general employees are feeling, how your business is operating. And then of course, some of the supplier interactions that you have as well is a great use of internal data. And then also, of course, you can always look at the cost of acquisition. So if you're just looking to sort of break even on your data investment, that's ultimately what you look at. But I think internal uses is one of the most important and key aspects to really valuing your data as a whole. So really the next sort of question behind that is who is really consuming that data, where is it being stored, and how is analysis being conducted here? So we have a graph displayed that really pinpoints some of the larger players in the market space and some of the newer players as well. You can see that the y-axis here just shows us basically when the company or platform really was first launched. So we can see that some of the oldest ones are Cognos, SAS, Information Builders, and Hyperion, names that we've been familiar with for a really long time. And then, of course, the x-axis just shows us some recent growth. So the ones furthest to the left are showing the highest recent growth, whereas the ones to the right are showing the highest recent growth, and the ones to the left are showing the lowest recent growth. So a lot of what we'll focus on today is really the top right-hand quadrant here, some of the newer, fastest growing platforms that offer some of the best analytical insight to a lot of the data that we'll talk about today. So these are things like Elastic, Cloudera, Tableau, and then Microsoft Power BI. A couple of them are really sort of based on the newer idea of incorporating big data. Things like Elastic and Cloudera really focus on the integration of not only your transactional data, but a lot of big data. And we'll talk a little bit about what big data means, how it varies a little bit from that traditional small transactional data in just a little bit. But a lot of what Elire is really excited about and a lot of what we've been working on is within that top right-hand quadrant. And it allows so much additional insight as compared to some of the more legacy systems, things like IBM Cognos and SAS and even Business Objects, which was really just more of a view of your transactional data. So we'll talk about those guys. We'll touch on some of their benefits in just a little bit as well. In terms of the delineation between what small and big data ultimately are, small data is really the kind of historical sense of what data is, how it's consumed, how it's stored within transactional database structures. So those are things like just what you traditionally think of as an Oracle database or Cognos Analytics. That's sort of where you utilize that small data. It really is just that relational database. Even if there are, hundreds of thousands of lines, that's still considered, small data. And it's just a moniker that helps oppose it to big data. I think we all know that small data, quote unquote, is not always traditionally small. We can have quite a few transactions. Usually that small data has also been more for that traditional internal data capture, things that are used for internal analytics, just internal tracking of product development, human resources, really things that are just the essential core of the business as well. Opposed to that, big data is really completely different in the way that it's stored. So the databases that Elastic and Cloudera run on are really outside the bounds of transactional data. One's built on Hadoop and another one is built on a Lucene library, which really they save each one of their bits of data as files instead of lines, which makes indexing and searching and compiling so much easier. And it allows you to also incorporate a lot more external data sources without having to worry about always mapping everything one-to-one to columns and tables. But instead, you can ultimately just kind of push those data sources into the database with less integration activity that needs to be conducted beforehand. And then, of course, a lot of times what's considered big data is really defined by the 3 V's, our volume, variety, and velocity. So volume obviously is centered around just the sheer volume that is generated from data itself. We're talking terabytes and terabytes of data here, not the gigabytes that we might be working with for the traditional transactional data itself. Some of just the things to note when thinking about really incorporating external data sources and where we're heading with the growth in data as a resource as a whole. There is this analysis that was done that 1.7 megabytes of data is being created every second for every person on Earth. And we're projected within the next 4 years to ultimately have 463 exabytes of data generated each day. And exabytes might be a little bit more of a nebulous term. To put that in perspective of terabytes, it's 1.04 billion terabytes. So we're talking about storing massive amounts of data if we're actually collecting all that. In terms of variety, that's where we really talk about a differing incorporation of external data sources, maybe on top of our internal data sources, mixing in different formats. So not only is it things like text, so maybe text files, maybe transactional information, maybe even emails, but you can also incorporate things like pictures, music, sound, recording bits, really anything that you can think of, you can ultimately store within a big data platform. And when you think about that in terms of some of the imaging that goes on with an ERP, like a check imaging system, that's really where you can see sort of the key linkages between utilizing some of the imaging services that big data provides, along with the linking to transactional data, which instead of having to code a system or have an individual intervention where maybe things are mapped, it allows you just incredibly fast processing to be able to link different data sources together. The last V that we'll talk about is centered around velocity itself. So that's really the speed at which data is coming in, but not only the speed, but that variation in speed. So we can think about it as either driving on a highway or getting off and taking the street roads through the city. We're either seeing just a constant fast speed, or maybe there's these periods where we're going, periods where we're stopping. And big data is designed to handle that change in velocity. So how we're differing in that consumption speed is a key essential piece of big data as well. In terms of why visualization is important, so this is really taking the next step. We've talked about some of the background information around data as a whole, what it means to consume and use small data versus big data. But even with that smaller transactional data, I think everybody's aware how important visualization is. And there are really a lot of key advantages that I'm going to touch on before we dive into just some of the use cases around visualization as a whole. And the first one is obviously just allows us to consume a sheer amount of data much faster than we would have from just looking through transactional lines. You can think about it as instead of having a couple dozen lines of growth in sales over the last few years, maybe we have a bar graph. That is just a simplistic example, but it illustrates how much easier it is to actually consume data when it's within a visualization format. It allows you also to quickly interact and intervene. A lot of the platforms now, and specifically the ones that we'll touch on with Elasticsearch and Kibana, really allow us to drill in, intervene, look at specific transactions that are generating certain statuses within our analytics platform as a whole. So that's a huge advantage as well, just being able to, instead of looking at a spreadsheet, finding something aberrant, and then having to go to a system, log in, take a look. Instead, you can immediately interact and intervene with a lot of the new platforms. Along with that interaction, it allows you to really identify patterns, set thresholds, and see when certain thresholds are ultimately crossed. A lot of what goes along with visualization now really helps users identify when certain metrics are hit or breached, and along with the interaction, allows you to immediately take a look and intervene. And it also helps you just understand the entire lineage of the story of data itself. Instead of maybe seeing one metric or generating one bar graph, instead, a lot of times now with the use of dashboards and some of the things that we'll see with the demo for Kibana and Elasticsearch is really centered around helping you understand the holistic story behind your data. So instead of having to make assumptions, it's easy to take one click here, move over to a linked visualization, take another click there, and really understand stories instead of just single points in a line. So in terms of big data, they differ in some of the use cases just a little bit, and we'll see sort of the first example as a traditional use of visualization around small data, and then the second one is really, it was really prescient because I think some of the things that are going on now we'll see some of the benefits to ultimately tracking the way that big data allows you to. So it allows for various things like warehouse optimization, fraud detection, and ultimately some of the best ones come with temporal and spatial aggregation. So helping you understand where data might be coming from, what time it was generated, and sort of the size that it goes along with that. So we'll go ahead and launch into just a couple of the use cases here before we hit our main demo. We can see here that this is a pretty hideous slide to look at. This is the first couple hundred rows of a file that ultimately amounts to 4,000 rows of location and population data for the 24,000 largest cities across the world. We can see that if we are searching for a location or a city, you might be able to use Control F, but it's definitely not going to help you compare between a lot of the really graphical representations of data as a whole. And we see this a lot of times, not only within something as simplistic as population and geographical data, but maybe it's where our applicants are coming from. Maybe it's understanding where our suppliers are based and the size that the size of business that we conduct with those suppliers as a whole, or maybe where our workforce is located in general. If we're looking at lines, it becomes a lot harder to actually glean useful interpretations of the data as a whole. So this is the comparison. This is what it would look like if you went and took those 24,000 cities and you plotted them on a map, and the bubbles are based on size instead. We can see that immediately, the comparison is much better. There's a lot less having to actually interact with those rows of data. And maybe we have, a supplier in Angola who's doing a lot of work for us. We can see if they're expanding sort of what the population workforce might be within Angola. Same with Jakarta, Tokyo, Seoul, Rio de Janeiro, Buenos Aires, just across the board. And a lot of times now, and we'll see this within some of the Kibana and Elastic visualizations, you can click on these and interact with these. It's pretty rare nowadays to encounter an analytics platform that doesn't allow you to interact and drill in and take a further look at what you're actually seeing. And we'll launch to just a second representation of the same sort of data set here. We can see that we've trimmed it down. We're just looking at the couple hundred largest cities within that spreadsheet now. And you can do that on almost any analytics platform up in this point. You can really interact with the data and make it so that it really fits your needs for what you're trying to visualize to analyze. So this is just some of that same representation. Again, this is a small data use case. You can sort of imagine where it could take you even with some of the other interpretations of some of the data sets that are really based around size and location and all those sort of nice things. The next use case is a little bit more advanced in terms of what we're actually looking at. And this is more of a big data use case based upon Elasticsearch. So right now we're looking at the dashboard for Furuno, Japan. Furuno, Japan is a shipping company, and they also make navigational instruments for ships as well. So their shipping division, they use basically onboard Elasticsearch diagnoses and Kibana visualizations to help not only track where their ships are at any given point within the world, but also allows them to see the data usage on ships, which is incredibly important because not only do you want to have your navigational instruments operating correctly, but you also want all your native communications to be able to connect. And you also want, for some of the softer side, your employees on those ships, the crew members, to be able to communicate with friends and family back onshore. So not only are you seeing a lot of the location data, but you can see as well that you can note if the ship is online or offline. And who knows, but a similar dashboard for Ever Given, if anybody's been following that situation in the Suez Canal that got stuck sideways when it went offline. Maybe some dashboard like this ultimately could have helped that organization as well. If they were having data issues before entering the canal, it would have been noted on something like this. So we can see even now that these use cases are important. In terms of fitting all these visualizations into a holistic DMA strategy, really the key thought around visualizations in analytics as a whole is it allows us to formulate these new hypotheses and really test them out without actually impacting our operational systems. So I think everybody has probably had a situation where they've tried to extract a query from either a secondary analytics instance or from the main environment for maybe an ERP system where it's caused some slowness. Maybe it took a few minutes to actually spit out your information, maybe even a few hours if you're working with tens of thousands of lines. Instead, with a nice analytics strategy within your data management analytics strategy as a whole, you can ultimately hypothesize and test in real time without actually having to impact the performance of either that secondary instance or the primary one. What goes along with that is it allows you to scale based upon all sorts of things, including your needs, the number of users that you have, and your business objectives for actually performing your analytics strategy. Another thing to note is a lot of the maintenance that goes on behind the scenes is ultimately important to your analytical clarity as a whole. So keeping all those things in mind, the scalability, the ability to formulate hypotheses, in the incorporation of all those data sources that we had talked about previously are really essential to being able to actually go in and perform the advanced analytics that your organization needs as a whole. So we've talked pretty abstractly about a lot of the analytic platforms as a whole. And I now want to launch into just a high-level demo of really what Elire thinks is one of the best platforms for really helping understand your organization, especially when it comes to ERP and HCM data, and is really centered around one of those top right-hand quadrant organizations that we saw earlier. It's really built upon Elasticsearch, and we'll see some of the Kibana visualizations that are driven by Elasticsearch. So with that, I will go ahead and do a couple things before I kick off really our video that helps highlight some of these. So just bear with me for 1 second.
Elire, along with integrated technology partners, are pleased to announce the availability of the full ELK stack, consisting of Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana in both PeopleSoft FSCM and HCM environments. Significant hours were spent researching, troubleshooting, and working through the configuration-sensitive ELK stack install. Through this, we obtained the expertise to perform and troubleshoot installs of a product with a steep learning curve for clients. Hey everyone, my name's Paul Harrell, and I'm part of the Elire PeopleSoft technical team focusing on PeopleSoft administration and data visualization. I've been in IT for over 20 years with enterprise-level organizations, focusing on architecture, application development, and database administration, with over 10 years PeopleSoft administration experience, focusing on tools and application upgrades, PUM, DPK, and ELK. PeopleSoft's procurement dashboards were created with multiple users and roles in mind. The procurement contracts dashboard was designed for contract administrators to quickly pinpoint procurement contracts set to expire by timeframe, show contract versus non-contract spend, and identify top suppliers with the highest dollar activity, to name a few of the options available for analysis. Procurement managers can see a comprehensive picture of their organizations using the Purchasing Effectiveness dashboard. At a glance, they can view purchase volume by business unit and period, top suppliers, purchase orders by payment terms, delivery performance, rejections and supplier returns, and budgeted dollars. Purchasing Operations dashboard provides buyers a holistic view of their purchase orders. They can use it as their to-do list to easily identify purchase orders needing their attention. Purchase orders have multiple statuses and are identified as separate visualizations. Buyers can view pending and past due deliveries, volume of purchase orders by month, and receipt details. Buyers can take action by clicking the View PO hyperlink at the bottom of the dashboard. Other Kibana visualizations in FSCM include AR collection analysis, collector performance, contracts header analysis, early detection and monitoring, financial performance analysis, GL operational insights, and trend analysis. The Workforce Equity Analytic can help ensure employees are being paid fairly. You are able to compare salaries of employees in the same job code along with other criteria like age, gender, and ethnicity. You can easily visually see if any employees are being paid less than other employees for similar work and investigate why, and take corrective action if needed. The Workforce Composition Dashboard enables you to view visualizations in Kibana based on the Person Index in Elasticsearch. Administrators can use the Workforce Composition Dashboard in Kibana to evaluate employee counts within their organization. Based on user privileges and criteria, such as departments and full or part-time status, administrators can analyze a subset or entire employee workforce numbers. The Application Details Visualization Dashboard provides visual insights into job applications. Use the Application Details interactive tile to view and interpret various information related to job applications. PeopleSoft Health Center enables you to monitor the health of your PeopleSoft application by providing real-time analysis of performance and load. The PeopleSoft Health Center can be used for self-monitoring of an application or for multiple systems in a single monitoring system. Additionally, PeopleSoft Health Center provides alerts that enable you to attend to immediate performance issues. For more information on getting the ELK stack into your enterprise, contact your Elire representative today.
So I think that video helps us highlight, and that demo in particular helps highlight some of the really key aspects behind visualizing a lot of just system data as a whole, and the incorporation of a lot of the big data sort of laden platforms helps us really drive new insights into business operations and ongoing operations as a whole. Next, we'll talk about some of the management of your data needs and when to really think about incorporating either a small data analytics platform or maybe incorporating some big data analysis into your organization as a whole. In terms of really sort of what we attribute small data to, it really helps track some of that internal performance, maybe some exceptions that might pop up, or some of those errors that you might need to have noted. One of the key things that it also helps track is a lot of your financial performance metrics, as well as some of your human capital management metrics. And I think we saw quite a few highlights of those within the demo itself. But I can't overstate that enough. Really helping incorporate some of those metrics into dashboards and visualizations as a whole is a massive benefit to any organization. It also allows you to do a lot of versatile things on some of the financial ins and outs as well. So incorporating things like payroll and other data sets from your organization within small data are really beneficial. These are where we see things like enterprise data warehouses being adopted and analytics platforms being built on those. In contrast, we see a lot of big data platforms, and in particular, Elasticsearch really bridging the gap. So Elasticsearch really helps you not only visualize small data in new, faster ways, but it allows you a base to, in your organization, be able to scale. A lot of the other platforms that are built around big data sort of lack the scalability that Elasticsearch has. And I think that's one of the huge advantages that we see. Not only is it incredible for the speed of consumption for maybe your smaller transactional data, but it also allows you to create new indexes for new data sets that might need to be incorporated down the road. So it allows you that flexibility without ultimately having to readdress maybe your data needs or your partners or suppliers. It really sets you up for beneficial things down the road, no matter where you want to go, either the consumption of more small data or the incorporation of big data and macroeconomic analysis as a whole. In terms of sort of the management on what to think about, regardless of sort of what direction your organization ultimately decides to take within analytics environment, I think one of the key ones is, or in terms of requirements, is obviously maintaining a low processing and transactional cost. We saw how low sort of that acquisition of data, the cost for that can ultimately go. So not being blinded by certain needs for data sets, but instead staying cognizant of those needs as well as pricing options. Because if you get priced out either on an analytics platform or the acquisition of data, it diminishes ultimately the return on your data management and analytics investment as a whole. One of the other things to obviously keep in your mind when basing your decisions around the processing and transactional cost is the ingestion capabilities of whatever system you're utilizing. So we touched on it with Elasticsearch being able to consume not only that small transactional data, but also big data. And then also thinking about that when you're incorporating maybe looking at a Tableau, a Domo, Power BI, really what are the ingestion capabilities? Does it sit on the primary instance where you get real-time analytics, or is it something that can only consume data sort of on a nightly basis? So you're delayed in your analysis. That's an important question to always ask. The next question I think is super important is based around your maintenance requirements. So how often are people ultimately going in to maintain data that's crawling over? How often are people needing to code maybe new tables or views, which is one of the huge downsides to our relational database analytics platforms now, is really the operational maintenance requirements for those are huge when you're looking at incorporating new data sets, whereas some of the newer platforms, the cost is greatly diminished, not only in terms of personnel, but also in development, because ingestion and maintenance needs are so diminished relative to some of the more legacy systems. And with any of those platforms that you decide to go with, or any of the sort of other requirements that are asked, you need always to be able to manage various scenarios and look at diverse data sets. You need to be able to hypothesize. We touched on the importance of hypothesis and really being able to test things out without having to impact certain systems or having to impact your data consumption. So always being able to look and see what various scenarios can be incorporated, how many variables, whether dependent or independent, can be incorporated within your models is always an important question to ask. And when you effectively manage these requirements, it really allows you to analyze just a broad spectrum, not only your data, but your scenarios as well. So a lot of scenario planning analysis can be done, and you can sort of develop a probabilistic outcome based on all sorts of different aspects that are driving either supply chain, revenue, or business operations as a whole. When incorporating all of that into sort of your effective data strategy, it really is centered around just the incorporation of all of those data sources in a method that is really beneficial to your organization as a whole and allows you to have the most visibility and the most insight available at any given point in time. I think we all know from COVID-19 and the shift to working from home or periods in office followed by periods out of office, inconsistent periods of shutdown. I think we all know the ability to access and the ability to be flexible in that access is huge. But along with that, the amount of time it takes to ultimately get a hold of the data that you need to be able to make any sort of informed analytics decision is incredibly important. When you do all of those things and you have the visibility that you need, you can really accomplish some great things like variable and regression analysis, predictive analytics, open your organization up to be able to conduct machine learning, and even advanced forecasting. So things beyond your annual budget analysis or budget projections, really things that are ultimately market driven and more insight around that space as well. The emerging trends that we're really seeing help push the space in the 2020s, and I think will be sort of the big spaces moving forward in terms of what you're looking at within an analytics strategy and what you need to incorporate to continue to keep your business at the forefront of any analytics strategy. The first of which is really centered around just the idea of smarter, faster AI. So AI really came around in the early 2000s. That's where we started to see some what we call decision tree analysis being done. So basically yes, no sort of decisions that help anybody doing analysis sort of find a path based on any sort of variables for any person or any scenario. That was really the birth, but now we're seeing those decision trees start to be phased out by a lot of natural language processing, so direct interaction with individuals as well as new AI, so the building of algorithms on top of those decision trees instead of relying on ultimately sort of the yes-no path ultimately to your issue resolution. You're seeing a lot of artificial intelligence and machine learning being conducted to advance algorithms so that they are more effective and more accurate than they previously were. Along with that, we're seeing sort of the adoption of what I'll call decision intelligence. So instead of a outcome generated through analysis driving your decision as a whole, now there's a lot more probabilistic weighting in terms of the decisions that you're driving. So really what we're geared toward at Elire and what we drive to assist everyone with is the access to data to be able to make decisions, not the phasing out of individuals being able to make decisions. And giving everyone a realistic breakout of the probability of certain outcomes occurring, instead of saying that the most weighted outcome is the one that's obviously going to happen. I think we all know that there are circumstances where everybody still needs to be empowered to make decisions because ultimately experience is a beneficial addition to analytics. Neither is a replacement for the other. One of the other things that really goes along with that is the idea of ledger database management, which is incredibly similar to sort of the thought process behind blockchain, just an immutable, transparent, and verifiable transaction log that allows you just immediate access to data that cannot be changed. That way that you know that the integrity of that data is always sound, regardless of who's doing the analysis, who's incorporating the data sets. It won't change. It can't be changed. And that's a great idea for anybody who's trying to do analysis shared across an organization. It helps the understanding of where that data came from and how it is immutable, help that probabilistic weighted decision as a whole. And it helps as a supplement as well, something that you can feed over as a secondary instance to always have a verifiable log whenever you need to check ultimately your analytics decisions as a whole. With that, we'll hop into key takeaways. So we'll talk about some of the big things that are driving analytics, some of the trends, and what to look for when implementing an analytics strategy as a whole. The first and foremost, I think we saw within the last 70 years, it really is an ever-changing space. you need to be able to have that flexibility and scalability to ultimately get the level of analysis that your organization needs. Traditional and big data analytics are complementary strategies for a holistic data strategy. Neither is a replacement for another. There are some products that help you visualize both, but of course, one should never replace the other. They should be sort of mutually beneficial to each other. And we saw, of course, the Elasticsearch immediate interaction with ERP system data. And those platforms that are specifically built like Elasticsearch and Kibana allow you to do that without actually impacting your system performance. So instead of drawing on the transactional tables that your systems or your graphical user interfaces actually perform on top of, it allows you that direct interaction without drawing any of the processing power away from that piece as well. And some of the trends that we saw towards the end of the presentation, we're pushing into a new space based upon data integrity and probabilistic weighted decision, which is helping every organization make more informed, more accurate, and more beneficial decisions than ever before. With that, I will go ahead and open up Q&A.
Thank you, Dayton. It does look like we have a question in the chat here. So it says, what is your visualization tool, MS, Power BI, or Tableau, and are you housing the ERP data in a data lake?
So we use a couple of different visualization tools. The key one that we saw today was really Kibana driven. That lives on top of Elasticsearch, and it is on top of a Lucene library, which is sort of similar to a data lake, but it doesn't exist on any sort of external platform. It instead exists for immediate consumption of that data within the primary server or the primary server instance. And it's specifically designed not to draw on those transactional tables.
Thank you. And one more that just popped in here. So can you talk about the relative impact on performance of using Kibana for analytics versus relying on reports and queries within PeopleSoft?
Definitely. So reports and queries within PeopleSoft really draw upon the memory and processing power of PeopleSoft and the database instance as a whole. You can sort of think about it as getting that slowness from the query, having, if a ton of queries are running in the system at the same time, there could be potential slowness issues with those queries. In contrast, because Kibana and Elasticsearch sort of sit separate but are complementary objectives to PeopleSoft, you don't have any of those slowness concerns within the same server as long as proper memory is allocated to both. So instead of driving up the memory within PeopleSoft and potentially having issues, you have sort of this separate space where all your analytics is going on. And because the processing power of the Elasticsearch platform is so much more dynamic and capable for handling large scale sort of data feeds, it is way more beneficial in terms of your memory usage to shift your analytics capabilities to Kibana and Elasticsearch whenever possible.
Excellent. Thank you, Dayton. And with that, we are right at time here. If you do have any additional questions, as always, feel free to submit them to the strategysummit@elire.com email address, and we can get them addressed after the presentation. Our next session coming up in about 5 minutes here is how to select the right technology for your business, building an application roadmap. And that link was just dropped in the chat. With that, we want to thank Dayton for his time today and look forward to seeing the rest of you at additional sessions later today.